There is a moment, if you have played Elden Ring, that you do not forget. A fog gate at the end of a dead garden. A woman kneeling in front of a sword driven into stone and root. And then she rises, and something in the room changes, because you understand, on some pre-verbal level, that you are not fighting a boss. You are fighting a wound that learned how to walk. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is routinely discussed as the hardest fight in Elden Ring, and that conversation is not wrong, but it is small. It treats her like a mechanical event, a checkpoint of parries and heal punishes and waterfowl dance timings, something to be solved and then forgotten. What almost nobody sits with, because the game refuses to let you sit with it easily, is what Malenia actually is underneath the mechanics. She is not a monster. She is not simply a knight. She is the closest thing in Elden Ring to a walking definition of what happens when divinity, disease, love, and grief are fused into a single body, and then that body is asked to keep functioning anyway. This is going to be a long look at her, and I mean that in every sense. We are going to start at the beginning, before she was ever called the Severed Goddess, before Radahn, before the Halig Tree, back in Caelid when it was still called Aeonia and it was still green. We're going to trace the actual textual evidence for what Scarlet Rot is, not as a status effect, but as a theological event happening inside her body. We are going to look hard at her bond with Miquella, a bond the game treats as sacred and untouchable, in which the closer you look, becomes one of the most quietly disturbing relationships in the entire narrative, precisely because neither character is written as a villain. We are going to reconstruct the battle with Radahn as it is described by the people who were there, not as it is staged for the player, because those two versions of the fight do not agree with each other, and the gap between them is where a great deal of the real story is hiding. And we are going to end in the genuinely unresolved territory, what she is after Radahn kills her the first time, what the Halig Tree actually represents as a piece of architecture and theology, and what it might mean that the game gives you, in the ending, the option to let her finish what her body has apparently been trying to do since the day she was infected. None of this is going to be delivered as trivia. I am not interested in reciting item descriptions at you like a wiki with a narrator bolted onto it. I want to actually think through what these fragments mean when you put them next to each other. Because From Software did not write Malenia's lore as a single clean document sitting in one place waiting to be read. They scattered her across dozens of item descriptions, environmental details, an NPC questline that most players never fully see, and a handful of throwaway lines from other characters who knew her before she became what she is now. When you gather all of that and lay it side by side, a shape starts to form that is stranger, sadder, and considerably more disturbing than cool rot lady with a sword arm. So let's start where her story starts. Not with the fight, with the child. Malenia was born a demigod, one of the many children of Radagon and Mareka, which by itself tells you she was born into an impossible situation, because every child of the two souled god monarch of the lands between was born already carrying the seeds of catastrophe. But Malenia's catastrophe arrived earlier and more literally than most of her siblings. She was born a twin, bonded to her brother Miquella in a way the game repeatedly, insistently describes as more than ordinary sibling closeness. The item description for the unalloyed gold needle, one of the most important and most easily missed texts in the entire game, tells us plainly that Malenia and Miquella were joined at birth by a power that even the Golden Order itself found troubling. An inseparability that the text frames less like affection and more like a fused biological and spiritual state, something closer to two halves of a single organism than two siblings who happen to love each other. That detail matters more than it looks like it does on first read, because it establishes the pattern for everything that follows. Malenia's entire life, from the moment of her birth, has been defined by not being fully separate from someone else. She does not get to be simply herself. She is always half of a pair, always oriented toward Miquella's needs, always described in relation to him before she is described in relation to anything else, including her own body's slow collapse into rot. Keep that thread in your head, because we are going to come back to it when we talk about the Halig Tree, and again when we talk about the ending where she offers to become his consort in the Age of Compassion. The bond described at her birth is the same bond that governs the last thing she does in the story. Nothing about that closeness ever loosens. If anything, it tightens as she deteriorates, until by the end it is difficult to tell where her devotion to him ends, and where the compulsion imposed on her by that original binding begins. The twin bond alone would be enough material for a fascinating character, but almost immediately, something else was layered on top of it. something that turns Malenia from demigod with an intense sibling bond into something closer to a walking theological crisis. She was infected, extremely early in her life, with Scarlet Rot. Now, most players encounter Scarlet Rot first as a status effect in a swamp, a green bar that fills up and eventually kills you, mechanically similar to poison but nastier. That framing is almost aggressively misleading, because within the actual cosmology of Elden Ring, Scarlet Rot is not a disease in the way we understand disease. It is the physical manifestation of an outer god, a force from beyond the lands between, that operates on the same conceptual tier as the frenzied flame or the formless mother worshipped by the fingers. Scarlet Rot has its own agency, its own hunger, its own slow, patient logic. It does not simply kill things, it transforms them, and in transforming them, it spreads itself further, using the transformed body as both a vector and a kind of living temple. Every ruin choked in that red bloom, every field of Caelid turned into a dead orange wasteland, every corpse still twitching with rot flies, is evidence of the same underlying event, an outside force that got into the lands between and began converting matter into itself. Malenia caught this as an infant or a young child, and this is one of the places where the game is genuinely cruel in how it withholds information, because we are never told precisely how. We are told, through the unalloyed gold needle again, that Malenia's affliction with rot began so early and burned so viciously that it should have killed her outright, and that Miquella, faced with his twin sister dying in front of him, essentially performed an act of applied theology to keep her alive. He is described as having unalloyed her, purging or sealing away the rot at its worst points, using his own nascent divine power as a child to hold his sister's body together by force of will and blessing. This is almost never how child gods are described doing anything in this setting. It is an extraordinary act, and it is also, if you think about what it actually means, the origin point of everything horrifying that follows. Because Miquella did not cure Malenia. He could not cure her. What he did was stabilize an uncurable condition through continuous intervention, which means from that point forward, Malenia's survival was permanently, structurally dependent on Miquella's ongoing involvement in her body. She was not saved. She was placed on life support built out of her brother's love and power, and that life support required renewal. This is the seed of the entire tragedy, and I want to sit on it for a second because it's easy to blow past. A child gets sick with a disease that is, in the metaphysics of this world, an actual invasive god trying to convert her into part of itself. Her twin brother, also a child, intervenes and manages to hold the disease at bay, but not eliminate it. From that day forward, she carries an active infection that her own body is constantly losing ground to, checked only by intermittent divine intervention from someone she is already fused to at a soul level. Every single fight you have with her, every animation of blossoms of rot erupting from her wounds, every moment where a killing blow triggers her second phase instead of ending the fight, all of it is downstream of a decision made in childhood by two children who did not have any good options. It's worth pausing on what checked only by intermittent divine intervention actually meant in practice, because the game gives us fragments suggesting this was not a one-time childhood fix, but an ongoing relationship of dependency that shaped Malenia's entire adolescence. Miquella's power is explicitly tied to compassion into a kind of soft, persuasive divinity, the same power he would later use to charm Mog and to attempt to reshape the lands between into an age of compassion. Using that power on Malenia again and again, holding back an outer god's infection through sheer applied love, is not something that scales indefinitely. Gods in this setting are not infinite. Marika herself shattered under the weight of her own grief. Radagon split himself in two and still could not hold the Elden Ring together without help. Miquella, a child, was pouring himself into his sister's body every time the rot threatened to overwhelm her, and there is a reading of the text. Supported by just how much of Miquella's later life becomes obsessed with escaping the burden of empathy itself, that this early, repeated act of literally holding his sister's disease at bay through compassion is where his later revulsion toward unbounded empathy actually originates. We'll get to that when we talk about the cocoon and the age of compassion properly. But keep it filed away, Miquella's relationship to his own defining trait, compassion, is not simple admiration. There's exhaustion buried in it, and Malenia's illness may be the first place that exhaustion was forged. What this means for young Malenia is that she grew up as a demigod whose body was, from the earliest age she can likely remember, a battlefield. Not metaphorically. Literally, somewhere inside her, at a cellular level if we can even use that word for beings like this, an outer god's touch was permanently present, held in check rather than removed, waiting for any opportunity, any wound, any moment of weakness to advance. This is why her boss fight works the way it does, mechanically, when you land a hit that should be a serious blow. Sometimes the game does not let it register as ordinary damage. It triggers bloom. The rot erupts outward from the wound like the disease is not merely present in her but eager, straining against containment, seizing any breach in the container as an opportunity to flower. That is not a boss designer making a cool particle effect. That is, textually, the actual thing that has been happening inside Malenia's body since childhood, made visible for the first time because you, the player, are finally hurting her badly enough to overwhelm whatever containment Miquella built. And this is where I want to slow all the way down, because most retrospectives on this fight treat the healing mechanic, the way she regains health when she lands blows on you, as a cool, thematically appropriate gimmick. Rot heals through corruption, how fitting, moving on. But if you take the lore seriously, that mechanic is not a gimmick. It is the literal mechanical enactment of what Scarlet Rot does as an outer god. It does not simply damage, it converts. It takes loss, decay, wounding, and turns that raw material into growth, into spread, into more of itself. When Malenia heals off your blood after landing a hit, she is not healing in the conventional sense any more than Caelid's rot flowers are healing the corpses they grow out of. She is demonstrating in real time in a boss arena the actual physics of the god that lives inside her. Every player who has ever screamed at their screen because Malenia just recovered half her health bar off one combo has, without realizing it, experienced firsthand what it must be like to be a piece of the lands between caught in the path of the rot's actual nature. It does not destroy and then stop. It destroys and grows. This reframes the entire fight, if you let it. You are not fighting a woman with a disease. You are fighting the disease, wearing a woman as its most complete and most tragic vessel, in the one place in time where it has been allowed to express itself almost without restraint. Because Miquella is gone, and the thing that used to hold it back is no longer there to hold it back. Which brings us to the second phase. And I want to talk about the second phase specifically before we even get to Radon or the Haligtree in sequence. Because I think the second phase of the Malenia fight is the single most lore-dense 5 minutes of animation in the entirety of Elden Ring, and it gets talked about almost exclusively in terms of difficulty. Waterfowl Dance. The unlock of Malenia's wings. The transformation into what the community informally calls Goddess of Rot form. All of that discourse is about parry windows and dodge timing, and none of it is wrong to discuss, but it steps directly over what is actually happening in the fiction at that moment, which is that you are watching Malenia, for the only time in the game, stop holding herself together. Think about what the first phase of that fight actually is. It's controlled. Deliberate, formal even. Her swordplay has structure, has a courtly, disciplined quality that matches everything we're told about her as a knight, as the undefeated champion who never lost a single duel in her life before Radon. That control is, I'd argue, not just a character trait. It's an act of will layered on top of an act of will. She is a demigod holding a disease in check through discipline, the same way Miquella held it in check through applied compassion, except now Miquella isn't there, so the discipline has to do all the work alone. And it can. For a while. It can hold phase 1, because you haven't hurt her badly enough yet to threaten the seal. Then you do. You take her health down past the threshold, and what happens on screen is that she screams, and her body opens, quite literally, into a second monstrous shape, wings of Scarlet Rot blooming outward from her spine, her hair unbinding, her weapon changing, her entire fighting style shifting from disciplined swordplay into something feral and desperate and much, much faster. That is not a difficulty spike bolted onto the fight for pacing reasons, even though it functions as one. In the fiction, that is the exact moment the containment fails. That is what it looks like, according to this game's internal logic, when an outer god finally gets to stop being held back and is allowed for a handful of minutes to simply be what it is. The controlled, courtly knight is gone in that moment, because the will that was suppressing the rot has been overwhelmed, and what's left underneath is not a person losing a fight. It's a god's disease finally getting the wound, the crisis, the moment of weakness it has apparently been waiting an entire lifetime for. And I think this is worth stating plainly, because it changes how you should feel about beating her. When you win that fight, you are not simply defeating a very hard boss. Within the story the game is telling, You are the first and only force in Malenia's entire adult life to actually push her illness past the point where willpower and Miquella's long-absent blessing can contain it. And you are doing that to a woman who has spent her whole life being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she has to hold this together herself now, because the person who used to help her hold it together left. That leaving is the next thing we need to actually reconstruct properly, because Radahn defeated Malenia and the Rot was unleashed as a consequence is the summary version, the version you'd get from a wiki entry, and it is technically true and almost completely useless for understanding what actually happened, why it happened, and what it says about both of these characters. Here is the timeline as best it can be reconstructed from item descriptions, environmental storytelling in Caelid, and the testimony you get from other characters who reference the battle. Malenia as a young adult was undefeated. Not undefeated in the sense of very good, undefeated in the specific absolute sense the game repeats multiple times. She never lost a single duel. She was sent, or she went, depending on which fragments you weight more heavily, to Caelid, then called Aeonia, to fight Starscourge Radahn. A demigod renowned as one of the greatest warriors and generals the Lands Between had ever produced. A man who had, among other things, once wrestled a gravity-warping meteor to a standstill in single combat. This was not a small fight between minor nobles. This was, by every account we have, one of the largest and most consequential single combats in the setting's history. Two demigods of genuinely mythic combat ability meeting in open battle with armies effectively watching. And the thing that makes this fight so important to the overall story is that Malenia lost. She lost the only duel of her life, and losing it did something to her that losing does not ordinarily do to demigods. It broke the seal. Here's the part that I think most retellings underplay, because it's genuinely uncomfortable if you think about it for more than a few seconds. The reason her loss to Radahn had catastrophic consequences is not simply she got hurt badly and the Rot escaped. It's that Malenia, understanding she was losing, or perhaps simply pushed past the threshold of controlled containment by the sheer violence of the fight, made a choice. The item descriptions around this event, particularly context clues from Radahn's own gear and from NPC dialogue referencing the battle, strongly suggest that Malenia deliberately released her full Rot bloom during the fight with Radahn, essentially choosing to let the disease consume both her control and, indirectly, the surrounding region, rather than simply lose cleanly. Some readings frame this more sympathetically, as an involuntary final surge, the body's last desperate attempt to survive a fight it was losing. Other readings, and I lean toward taking this one seriously rather than softening it, suggest something closer to a choice, that Malenia, faced for the first time in her life with the reality of defeat, unleashed the very thing she had spent her entire life suppressing, essentially weaponizing her own disease as a last resort against an opponent who had beaten her by every other measure. If that second reading is correct, and I think the game wants us to at least seriously entertain it, then the Scarlet Rot outbreak that turned all of Aeonia into Caelid, that turned to green. Populated region into the diseased wasteland players actually walk through in the base game was not an accident that happened to Malenia. It was something Malenia did, or at minimum something Malenia allowed to happen through her, in the moment she could not accept losing. That is an enormous, uncomfortable thing to sit with about a character the marketing and a huge amount of fan discourse treats as a tragic, sympathetic figure, and I don't think acknowledging it undercuts the sympathy. I think it deepens it, because it means Malenia's tragedy is not simply bad thing happened to good person. It's a person carrying an unbearable weight her entire life finally set that weight down in the worst possible place, at the worst possible moment, and an entire region and everyone in it paid the price. Think about what was actually lost when Aeonia became Caelid. This wasn't an empty wasteland before the Rot. It was a populated, fertile region. The game's environmental storytelling in Caelid is relentless about this, if you actually stop and look instead of sprinting through it to avoid the Scarlet Rot swamps, ruined towns, dead festival decorations still hanging in the wind, the remains of what was clearly an entire functioning society, now populated by rot-twisted dogs and crows, and the wandering husks of people who did not die quickly. Radahn's own castle, Redmane, still stands as essentially the last defended holdout in the region, a fortress permanently on siege footing against an enemy that isn't an army, it's an environment. It's the ground itself and the air itself slowly trying to convert everyone inside into more rot. That entire ongoing catastrophe. The thing General Radahn's remaining loyal knights are still fighting a losing defensive war against by the time you reach them in game. traces back to one afternoon, one duel, one moment where Malenia's control gave way. And here's the detail that I think reframes the entire relationship between Malenia and Radahn in a way most people don't sit with. By the time the player actually reaches Radahn, decades after this catastrophic battle, he has been catatonic, gravity-locked in an endless festival, essentially removed from time, at Malenia's own bidding. The Radahn festival that you, the player, are invited to and eventually have to fight your way through to reach him exists because Malenia asked for it. She is the one who arranged, through Miquella's power and the complicity of Radahn's remaining knights, to keep Radahn suspended in a permanent, meaningless celebration, rather than let him die of old age or succumb to the rot spreading through his own domain. Some readings treat this as an act of respect, keeping her one true rival alive and preserved rather than letting him fall to disease or decay. Other readings treat it as something closer to guilt, an attempt to freeze the one person who ever beat her in amber so that the consequences of that defeat, the region-wide catastrophe it caused, never have to fully resolve. I don't think the game forces you to pick only one of these. I think both are true simultaneously, the way most of the emotionally complicated things in this story are true simultaneously. Malenia respects Radahn enough to want to preserve him. Malenia is also, I would argue, unable to let the moment of her only loss actually conclude, because concluding it means accepting what happened afterward, means accepting Aeonia, means accepting what she did or allowed to happen to an entire region full of people who had nothing to do with her fight. Now we need to talk about what happened to Malenia's body after that battle, because the game is oddly precise about this in a way that's easy to miss if you're not cross-referencing item text with what you actually see when you fight her. She lost an arm and a leg in the fight with Radahn. This is not incidental damage. Losing limbs to a demigod-tier opponent should, by any reasonable expectation, be the kind of wound that ends a combatant's career even if it doesn't end their life. Malenia's response to this was to have those limbs replaced, not with ordinary prosthetics, but with prosthetics grown, essentially cultivated, from rot itself. Her missing leg and arm were rebuilt using the very disease that nearly killed her as an infant, and that she unleashed catastrophically as an adult, deliberately integrated into her body as functional replacement tissue. Sit with that choice for a second, because I think it's one of the most quietly horrifying character details in the entire game. And it almost never gets discussed with the weight it deserves. Malenia did not defeat the rot and then get better. She did not find some other cleaner way to replace lost limbs, the kind of way other characters in this setting clearly have access to, whether through smithing, through grace, through any number of other methods the Lands Between offers. She chose, or was left with no better option and accepted, rot-grown limbs. She rebuilt her own body, quite literally, out of the disease that has been trying to consume her since childhood. From the moment those limbs were grown, Malenia was not a demigod who happens to carry Scarlet Rot as an affliction anymore. She is, physically, partially made of it. It is not simply inside her. It is load-bearing. It is holding her up. If you removed all the rot from Malenia's body at this point in her life, by the time you actually fight her, you would not be curing her, you would be killing her, because a meaningful percentage of her physical structure requires it to keep functioning. This is, I think, the single most important piece of context for understanding the boss fight's second phase honestly, more important even than the childhood infection, because it means the relationship between Malenia and Scarlet Rot, by the time you meet her, is not adversarial anymore, not in any simple sense. She is not a person fighting off a disease. She is a person who has, over decades, been forced by circumstance into an increasingly intimate integration with that disease, until the disease is not just present in her, it is part of her architecture. The wings that erupt in Phase 2 are not an external growth bursting out of an otherwise healthy body. They are, in a sense, the most honest version of her actual physical structure. The version that exists when nothing is holding the rot components of her body to their assigned disciplined shapes anymore. There's a version of this story where you could frame that as body horror, straightforwardly monstrous, and the game absolutely lets you read it that way, if that's the read you want. But I think the more interesting reading, the one that actually explains why so many players who beat this fight describe feeling something closer to grief than triumph, is that Malenia's second phase isn't a monster being revealed underneath a woman. It's a woman whose entire adult existence has required her to build herself, quite literally, out of trauma, finally being seen without the discipline she's used her whole life to hide how thoroughly that trauma has remade her. Let's talk now about the Halig Tree. Because the Haligtree is where all of this, the twin bond, the rot, the loss to Radon, actually gets built into architecture. And I don't think you can understand what the Haligtree is, thematically, without understanding everything we've just walked through. The Haligtree is described as a sanctuary, a place Miquella built specifically to try to actually cure Malenia, not merely contain her condition the way his childhood intervention had, but genuinely heal her at the root. It's grown from a seed of the Erdtree itself, planted in Caelid of all places, which is already a staggering, almost defiant piece of symbolism if you think about it. Miquella took the seed of the tree that represents the Golden Order's vision of unified, uncorrupted divinity, and planted it directly in the epicenter of the very catastrophe his sister's disease had caused, as if trying to grow a cure out of the ground zero of the disaster. The tree that resulted grew twisted, and this matters. It did not grow into a clean, golden mirror of the Erdtree the way it was presumably meant to. It grew warped, thorned, difficult to even physically access, guarded by increasingly hostile and monstrous defenders, until the sanctuary meant to heal Malenia became, functionally, one of the most dangerous and inhospitable regions in the entire game. I don't think that's incidental world design. I think the Haligtree's failure to grow clean is the game telling you, architecturally, that this project was doomed from the start, that you cannot plant a seed of divine order directly into the wound left by an outer god's catastrophe and expect it to simply flourish as intended. That the ground itself, the very earth Ionia's rot had already claimed, was never going to produce an uncorrupted result. Miquella tried to build a cure on top of the disaster his sister's affliction had caused, in the same soil that disaster had poisoned, and the tree grew the way everything else in Caelid grows, wrong, thorned, hostile. Beautiful in a way that is inseparable from how dangerous it is. And inside that failed sanctuary, Malenia was placed to sleep in a chrysalis, essentially entombed, while Miquella continued whatever process he was attempting, and it did not work. Not the way it was meant to. The tree's own guardians, the Haligtree Knights, eventually turned hostile even to their own sanctuary's purpose. Something clearly went wrong at a structural level, and Malenia eventually woke on her own, incomplete, the cure unfinished, at some point after Miquella himself had already left, already begun the process that would eventually lead him to the Shadowlands, and the Land of Shadow storyline players encounter in the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion. That detail, that Malenia woke up alone, incomplete, inside a failed cure, after her brother had already left to pursue his own separate ambitions elsewhere, is I think the emotional center of gravity for this entire character, and it's the part that the base game handles with a kind of devastating restraint, because it never states it as bluntly as I just did. It lets you piece it together. Miquella spent his childhood pouring himself into keeping Malenia alive. He spent presumably years, possibly decades, growing an entire sanctuary and attempting a genuine cure, and at some point that project stalled, or failed, or simply was not enough, and Miquella's attention moved on to a larger ambition, the Age of Compassion. The plan that eventually required him to have himself carried away in a cocoon toward the Land of Shadow, pursuing a project so singular and so consuming that he apparently was willing to leave his own twin sister asleep in an unfinished chrysalis in a hostile, thorned tree in the middle of the region her own catastrophic loss of control had poisoned. I want to be careful here not to flatten Miquella into a simple villain, because I don't think the text supports that, and I don't think it's an interesting or honest reading. Miquella's entire character is defined by an excess of empathy, not a lack of it. His defining trait across the base game and the expansion is that he feels too much, cares too completely, to the point where his solution to the suffering of the lands between eventually curdles into something coercive, an attempt to engineer compassion itself as a kind of universal binding force rather than something people choose. Everything we know about him suggests the choice to leave Malenia unhealed, and asleep was not made casually or without cost to him. But intent doesn't change outcome, and the outcome is that Malenia, the person whose entire life has been defined by being fused to Miquella, by depending on Miquella's intervention to survive at all, was left. Whatever his reasons, however much it may have grieved him, he left her incomplete, and she woke up to that incompleteness alone. This, I think, is what actually explains her character when you finally encounter her as a boss. More than the rot, more than the Radon fight, more even than the childhood infection. You are not fighting a monster. You are not really even fighting primarily a woman defending her disease. You are fighting a person whose entire identity has been organized around a bond that failed to protect her the one time she needed it most, in the one place that was supposed to be her sanctuary, and who has apparently decided, in the absence of the brother who used to hold her together, to hold herself together through sheer discipline and violence instead. Because that is the only tool she has left. And I think this reframes the line she speaks if you manage to survive long enough into the fight to hear it, or read it in the item descriptions surrounding her boss soul, her insistence that she is undefeated in this arena, that only Radon has ever beaten her. It is not simple boastfulness. It's the last coherent piece of self-definition she has left. Her body has been rebuilt out of the disease that nearly killed her as a child. Her brother, the other half of her from birth, is gone, off pursuing a project that requires abandoning her mid-cure. The sanctuary meant to heal her grew into a hostile, thorned tomb. The only thing left that is unambiguously, completely hers, that no one else has taken or altered or left unfinished, is her record as a swordswoman, undefeated, except once. That single loss to Radon is not just a historical fact to her. Given everything else that's been stripped away or corrupted or abandoned, it may be the only wound she has left that is entirely legibly her own, rather than something imposed on her by disease, by family, by circumstance. Let's widen the lens now, because I think to really understand what Malenia is, you need to understand Scarlet Rot itself at the cosmic theological level the game operates on, not just as it manifests in her specifically. Elden Ring's cosmology, especially once you start pulling on threads from item descriptions across the entire game, rather than sticking to what's presented directly in cutscenes, is built around the idea that the lands between sits underneath what the game calls the Golden Order, a kind of imposed cosmic law maintained by the Greater Will, one of several outer gods. Entities from entirely outside the world that reach in and exert influence, sometimes benevolently, mostly not, on the world below. The Greater Will is the outer god behind the Erd Tree, behind the Golden Order, behind Marika's entire project of unifying and stabilizing the lands between under one coherent divine law. But it is not the only outer god with an interest in this world. And Scarlet Rot is, as far as the game's more obscure texts suggest, either the direct expression of a different outer god entirely, or a kind of infection carried by an entity separate from and hostile to the Greater Will's order. This matters enormously for how you should think about Malenia, because it means her body is not simply sick in the way a person can be sick with an ordinary disease. It is the site of an active theological conflict between two competing cosmic forces, one operating through the Golden Order and, indirectly, through her own divine bloodline as a child of Marika, and one operating through the rot that has been growing inside her since infancy. She is not a demigod who happens to have caught something. She is structurally a battleground, the literal place where two outer gods' influence over the lands between meets and contests territory, and that contest has been happening inside a single body since that body was an infant. Once you frame it that way, a lot of small details across the game start to click into a coherent, much darker picture. Consider why the Golden Order's own faithful, its own clergy and knights, treat Malenia's existence with such obvious, careful unease, even while officially honoring her as a demigod and a hero of the realm. Consider why the item descriptions around her tend to use language of containment and sealing, rather than language of healing or treatment, unalloyed, held back, kept in check. None of that is the vocabulary you'd use for someone recovering from an illness. It is the vocabulary you would use for someone who is at all times a live threat that has been temporarily stabilized. Consider why the Halig Tree, rather than simply being another demigod's territory the way Radon's Caelid or Rykard's Volcano Manor are, is treated as something closer to a quarantine zone. Difficult to reach, aggressively guarded, essentially cut off from the rest of the lands between's political and religious structures. None of that reads, once you take the outer god framing seriously, like the way you'd treat a beloved princess recovering from a childhood illness. It reads like the way you'd treat a containment breach that everyone has quietly agreed to manage rather than solve. Because nobody, including her own family, has actually figured out how to solve it. And this is where I think the game gets genuinely unsettling if you sit with it, because it means Malenia's own family, the people who are supposed to love her, who by every account do love her, have also spent her entire life managing her, in the specific sense that word carries when you're talking about a contained threat rather than a person. Miquella's intervention as a child was love, unmistakably, but it was also containment. The Halig Tree was built with love, but it was also functionally, quarantine architecture, a sanctuary shaped like a place you send something you're not sure you can actually cure. Even the decision to keep Radon suspended eternally in a festival rather than let him age and die, which we discussed earlier as possibly being about respect or possibly about guilt, can also be read through this lens, keeping the one person who ever beat her permanently on hold, permanently available as a kind of check or counterweight, in case Malenia's own containment fails again the way it failed at Aeonia. I don't think this is a cynical reading imposed from outside the text. I think it's what the text is quietly, carefully building toward, and I think the reason it works so well emotionally, the reason so many players come away from this story feeling genuinely devastated for Malenia rather than simply impressed by a hard boss fight, is that the game never lets any single person in her life be simply the villain of her containment. Miquella loves her and contains her. The Golden Order tolerates her and quietly quarantines her. Radon respects her, possibly even something more complicated than respect, and their fight is simultaneously the great tragic duel of her life and the exact event that let the thing everyone was containing get loose. Everyone around Malenia is doing love and containment at the same time, indistinguishable from each other, because that is apparently the only available relationship to something that is, from birth, both a beloved child and an active site of cosmic infection. This brings us to a question that I think deserves much more serious attention than it typically gets in discussions of this fight, which is, what exactly does Scarlet Rot want? Because if we're taking seriously the idea that it's the expression of an outer god, an entity with its own agency and its own logic, then it isn't simply a destructive force with no direction, the way a wildfire has no direction. Outer gods in this setting have goals, however alien those goals might be to human or demigod comprehension. The Greater Will wants unification under the Golden Order. The Frenzied Flame, another outer god whose influence you encounter through the Three Fingers, wants unbinding, wants everything reduced to the same primal chaos, wants an end to the layered, hierarchical structure the Golden Order imposes. What does the entity behind Scarlet Rot want? And what does it mean that it has apparently, since Malenia's infancy, wanted her specifically? The most compelling answer, and this is genuinely speculative, stitched together from implication rather than stated outright anywhere in the game's text, is that Scarlet Rot wants exactly what it's been slowly, patiently getting across Malenia's entire life: total integration. Not destruction of the host, but complete conversion of the host into an extension of itself. A process that has been happening gradually, in stages, since childhood, each crisis, the initial infection, the Radon battle, the rot-grown limbs, moving Malenia one step further from being a demigod who carries the rot, and one step closer to being something the rot is wearing. If that's correct, then everything we've discussed, Miquella's childhood intervention, the Haligtree, the Eternal Radon Festival, all of it, has not actually been managing a static condition. It's been a decades long, ultimately losing rearguard action against a process that was always going to complete itself, eventually, because that is simply what this particular outer god does to the things it touches, and it has never stopped touching Malenia, not for a single day since she was an infant. If you accept that framing, it also recontextualizes something that's easy to overlook, because it's presented so matter-of-factly in her boss arena, the environment itself. You fight Malenia in the Elphael, Brace of the Haligtree, specifically in a room that is clean, orderly, almost ceremonial compared to the rot-choked, thorned chaos of the rest of the tree around it. That's not accidental set design. That room is very likely the one space in the entire Haligtree that Malenia, or whatever remains of her discipline, has managed to keep clear, keep controlled, keep looking the way a proper knight's dueling hall should look, in the middle of a sanctuary that has otherwise completely lost the fight against the very disease it was built to cure. Every other corridor and chamber in that place has been reclaimed by rot, by hostile transformed guardians, by thorns that have grown wild and untended. That one room is the last holdout. It is essentially the physical manifestation of exactly the same thing her first boss phase represents, the very last piece of controlled, disciplined order she has left, maintained by will alone. Right up until you push her hard enough that even that final room's composure breaks, and the fight spills into Phase 2. I want to bring in a comparison here, because I think it clarifies what makes Malenia specifically so unusual, even among Elden Ring's many demigods and outer god-touched figures. Compare her to Mohg, the Lord of Blood, another demigod whose story involves being claimed, in his case quite literally, by an outer god, the Formless Mother, through the Three Fingers. Mohg's transformation reads very differently on screen and in text. Mohg embraces what he's become. He builds a cult around it, a whole theology of blood and sacrifice. He actively wants more of what's happening to him, seeks it out, tries to expand it, tries to drag Miquella himself into his blood-soaked vision through the formless mother's power. Mohg's relationship to his outer god is one of willing, even enthusiastic alliance. Malenia's relationship to hers is the opposite in almost every particular, and I think that opposition is the entire point of putting both characters in the same game. She has spent her whole life resisting, containing, holding back the exact process Mohg runs toward eagerly. Where Mohg's story is about surrender to an outside force as a kind of dark liberation, Malenia's story is about the exhausting, decades-long cost of refusing that surrender, of trying, with diminishing tools and an absent support system, to remain herself in the face of a force that very clearly, patiently, has never stopped trying to make her something else. When you finally beat her, you are not defeating someone who wanted this fight the way Mohg, in his own twisted way, wants his fight with you, wants the formless mother to have a chance to claim you too. You are defeating someone whose entire life has been the opposite of surrender, and who, even in her most monstrous second phase form, is still in some sense fighting against complete dissolution, rather than fighting for it. This is, I think, why the fight feels the way it feels, why so many players describe an odd, unexpected sadness on victory that they don't get from other extremely difficult bosses in the series. Mechanically brutal fights against gleefully evil or purely monstrous enemies produce triumph, relief, maybe grudging respect for the challenge. This fight produces something closer to grief, and I don't think that's an accident of difficulty tuning. I think it's because, on some level that doesn't require you to have read a single item description, the game communicates through pacing and animation, and that specific awful scream when Phase 2 triggers, that you are not ending a threat. You are ending someone's last exhausted attempt to keep being herself. Let's talk now about how other characters in the game actually discuss her, because their perspectives add real texture to all of this, and they don't always agree with each other, which I think is exactly right for a figure this contested. Rinola, Malenia's grandmother, Queen of the Full Moon, speaks of Malenia and Miquella both with a specific kind of weary sorrow that's distinct from how she talks about her other grandchildren. If you spend real time with Rinola's dialogue across a full playthrough, particularly the exchanges available once you complete her questline and she reflects more openly on her family, there's an undercurrent that reads less like pride in Malenia's achievements and more like grief over what was done to her, or what circumstance did to her, framed almost as a cautionary tale about the cost of being useful to the Golden Order's project. Rinola, remember, is a character defined by her own rejection of that project. Her own refusal to keep performing the role Mareka's court demanded of her after her marriage to Radagon was essentially dissolved by the Golden Order's needs. There's a reading where Rinola looks at Malenia and sees, more than a granddaughter, another woman whose body and life were shaped, from birth, around the needs of a larger cosmic and political project that never once stopped to ask what she actually wanted. And Rinola's sorrow is less I'm sad my granddaughter got sick, and more I recognize exactly what was done to her, because a version of it was done to me too. Sir Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing, offers a different angle entirely, one that's more clinical, more scholarly, and honestly a little chilling once you notice the pattern in how he talks about her. Gideon's entire character is built around the accumulation of knowledge as a substitute for actual moral engagement with the world. He knows an enormous amount about everything happening in the lands between, and does very little to intervene in any of it until it's convenient for his own goals. When Gideon discusses Malenia, and information about her comes up in a few of his exchanges, and in some of the broader context around his questline, the framing tends to treat her less as a person, and more as a phenomenon, a case study. An extraordinary and terrible fact about the world worth understanding and cataloging, rather than a tragedy worth mourning. I don't think this makes Gideon a villain specifically with regard to Malenia. His detachment is fairly universal. He treats most catastrophes in the lands between with the same removed curiosity, but it does provide a useful contrast, because it shows you what it looks like when someone encounters everything we've just spent an hour unpacking: the childhood infection, the Radon catastrophe, the failed cure, the abandonment, and responds with intellectual interest rather than horror or grief. It's a colder mirror held up next to Rinola's warmer, sadder one, and having both in the game keeps Malenia from being flattened into pure victim, pure tragedy, without any complicating outside perspective. There's also the testimony embedded in the environment of Redmane Castle itself, and the knights who still serve Radon's memory even decades into his catatonic suspension. These are people who fought alongside Radon, who presumably watched or at least heard direct accounts of the battle with Malenia, and their attitude toward her is respectful, in a way that's notably free of the unease that characterizes how the Golden Order's own faithful discuss her. To Radon's soldiers, she is simply the extraordinary rival their lord once faced, and by their own admission, barely defeated. Someone worth honoring precisely because she pushed the single greatest warrior general most of them had ever served to the absolute limit of his ability. There's no quarantine language here, no talk of containment or sealing, just soldiers' respect for a worthy and terrifying opponent. It's a reminder that how Malenia gets discussed depends enormously on who's doing the discussing and what they actually witnessed, versus what they've only heard secondhand through the more theologically anxious channels of the Golden Order's court. Taken all together, these outside perspectives triangulate something important. Malenia is not read the same way by everyone who encounters her story, and the game deliberately withholds a single authoritative account of what she is or what she means. To her grandmother, she's a casualty of a system that uses its own children as instruments. To the scholar, she's a fascinating and terrible data point. To the soldiers who watched her fight, she's simply the greatest opponent their own legendary commander ever faced. None of these readings cancel each other out. They coexist, the way real, complicated people generate genuinely different, equally valid impressions in the people around them, and I think that's part of why she resonates as a character rather than functioning purely as a plot device or a difficulty checkpoint. The game gives you enough conflicting testimony that you have to actually do the work of synthesizing your own understanding of her, the way you would with a real historical figure whose contemporaries left behind contradictory accounts. Now I want to move into what I think is the single most underappreciated piece of Malenia's story, which is what the base game explicitly does not resolve, and what the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion and specific ending content complicate even further, because this is where the story stops being simply tragic backstory and becomes something closer to an active, ongoing horror that the player is directly implicated in. At the end of the base game, if you pursue the specific questline and ending associated with the Age of Compassion, the ending most closely tied to Miquella's ambitions, there is dialogue and implication, reinforced and expanded significantly by material from the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion, that positions Malenia as intended to serve as Miquella's consort in the world he's trying to build. I want to be precise about how unsettling this actually is once you strip away the soft, mythic language the game uses to present it, because I think the soft language is doing a lot of work to make something genuinely disturbing feel like simple sibling devotion. Miquella's stated ambition, the thing that drives essentially the entire back half of his story and the entirety of Shadow of the Erdtree's central plot, is to become a god of compassion, to remake divinity itself around unconditional, absolute empathy, to build an age of compassion that will supposedly end suffering across the lands between. The mechanism by which he attempts to do this, revealed increasingly clearly across the expansion, is not persuasion. It's a kind of magical, spiritual binding, a charm so total it functions closer to enslavement than seduction. Something we see demonstrated with horrifying clarity in how he manipulates Mohg, and implied, more quietly but just as troublingly, in how he intends to use everyone drawn into his new godhood, willing or not. Miquella's compassion by the end of his arc is not gentle. It is a totalizing force that erases the ability to refuse it. And within that framework, Malenia is positioned, repeatedly, as the one figure closest to him, the one whose loyalty and bond with him precede even his transformation into whatever he's becoming, the twin who has been fused to him since birth, who has depended on his intervention to survive since infancy, and who across the entirety of both games has never once been shown expressing anything other than complete devotion to him and his goals. When the game gestures toward her rule as his consort in this new order, it's not introducing a new element to her character. It's the terminal point of a trajectory that's been building since the very first item description we discussed at the start of all this. The unalloyed Gold Needle's description of a bond even the Golden Order found troubling. Here's the uncomfortable question the text puts in front of you without ever quite stating it outright. Is Malenia's devotion to Miquella, across the entire span of her life, ever actually something she chose, in any sense that resembles free choice as we'd normally understand it? She was bonded to him at birth, before she had any capacity to consent to that bond. Her survival from infancy onward was made structurally dependent on his continued intervention. Every act of devotion she's ever shown him, holding herself together through the Radon fight and its aftermath, arranging his eternal festival preservation, apparently waiting, incomplete. And the Haligtree for his return exists inside a relationship that was never freely entered into by either party, because neither party was ever offered the option of not being fused together from the moment they were born. I don't think the game wants you to conclude that Malenia doesn't genuinely love her brother, or that her devotion is purely coerced with no authentic feeling behind it. I think that would actually be simpler and less disturbing than what the text is doing, which is presenting a relationship where authentic love and structural, inescapable dependency are so thoroughly fused together that it becomes impossible, maybe even for Malenia herself, to separate them. She loves him. She has also never, not for a single day of her existence, had the chance to find out who she would be, what she would want, who she would love, absent that bond. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the horror of her story is not that her devotion is fake, it's that it's completely genuine and also completely inescapable, and those two facts do not cancel each other out, they compound each other. This is why I find the framing of her as intended consort so much darker than it initially presents. It's not simply brother and sister have an unusually close relationship, and there's a suggestion of something more. It's the natural, almost inevitable endpoint of a lifetime, spent with no space carved out for Malenia to exist as anything other than half of a pair. Oriented entirely around Miquella's needs, his survival efforts on her behalf, his cure attempts, and now his final ambition to remake godhood itself. Every version of Malenia we've walked through in this video, the disciplined knight, the rot-consumed second phase, the guilt-ridden keeper of Radon's eternal festival, the abandoned sleeper in an unfinished chrysalis, all of them are, in the end, versions of a woman whose entire selfhood has been structured around one relationship she never chose, and has never, as far as any text in this game shows us, seriously questioned. This is a good point to bring in what the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion actually does with all of this, because the DLC's approach to Malenia is genuinely unusual, and I think deliberately so. She is, for almost the entirety of the expansion, absent, not forgotten. The game does not let you forget her. Her presence haunts the Land of Shadow constantly through implication, through the enormous rot-corrupted growths you find scattered across that realm, through direct references from other characters. But she herself is not physically present as a character you interact with for most of the DLC's runtime. And then, in one of the expansion's most quietly devastating reveals, you learn what actually happened to Radon, the man Malenia lost her only duel to, the man she preserved for decades in an eternal festival. Radon, it turns out, was resurrected, brought into the Land of Shadow, and grafted, quite literally, with Malenia's own remains. This is not metaphorical. The boss you eventually face in the Dilkey, Radon as he appears there, is built, physically, from a fusion of Radon's own body and Malenia's rot-consumed remains, meaning that at some point after the events of the base game, Malenia died, or was killed, or her body was otherwise rendered into raw material, and Miquella used that material to reconstruct Radon as a weapon, a champion, an instrument for his own ends in the Land of Shadow. I want to make sure the weight of that lands properly, because it's easy to process this as simply cool boss lore twist and move on. Everything we spent the first half of this video walking through, the childhood bond so intense the Golden Order itself found it troubling. The rot-grown limbs that made her body partially constructed out of the very disease trying to consume her, the decades spent maintaining an eternal festival to preserve the one man who ever beat her, the entire architecture of devotion and dependency between Malenia and Miquella, all of it ends, according to the expansion's reveal, with Miquella using his sister's remains as construction material for a weapon built in the shape of her one great rival. The woman who spent her whole life fused to her brother's needs becomes, quite literally, raw material for her brother's next project, fused this time not to Miquella himself, but to the man whose defeat of her set off the entire catastrophe that defined the second half of her life. There is a reading of this that's almost unbearably cruel if you take it fully seriously, and I don't think the game is protecting you from that cruelty. I think it's presenting it plainly and trusting you to feel the full weight of it. Malenia spent her entire existence subordinated to Miquella's needs. First his need to save her, then his need to cure her, then, implicitly, his intended need for her as consort in his new order, and in the end, when that entire arc apparently fails or is superseded by his other ambitions, what remains of her is repurposed, physically, into another instrument entirely, resurrecting the very man whose victory over her caused the catastrophe that shaped everything that followed. Even in death, she does not get to simply be finished. Her body becomes part of the next chapter of someone else's story. There's a slightly gentler reading available too, and I don't think it's dishonest to hold both in mind at once. You could read Miquella's decision to fuse her remains with Radon's resurrected body as, in its own twisted way, an act of reunification, bringing together in death the two figures whose duel had defined so much of Malenia's life, an attempt, however grotesque in execution, to finally resolve something that had been left unresolved since Aeonia. Whether that reading feels like tenderness or like one more example of Miquella making enormous, irreversible decisions about his sister's body and legacy without her consent, decades after her death, probably depends on how much grace you're willing to extend to a character whose entire arc, by that point in the story, has curdled into exactly the kind of coercive, boundary-erasing compassion we discussed a moment ago. I lean toward the darker reading, honestly, because everything else we know about Miquella's trajectory by the time of the Dilk suggests a character who has stopped asking whether the people around him consent to what he's doing to and with them, and it would be strange for that pattern to suddenly reverse itself specifically in how he treats his sister's remains. Let's actually look at the fight itself in the DLC, because the mechanics of that encounter reinforce this reading in ways that I think are easy to miss if you're focused purely on survival. Which, fair enough, that fight demands most of your attention regardless of what you're thinking about lore-wise. The Radon you face in the Land of Shadow does not fight like the Radon you may remember from the base game, if you fought him there. He fights, in significant part, like Malenia. Aggressive, rot-infused attacks, bloom effects on hit. A fighting style that has clearly absorbed elements of her aggression, her willingness to close distance relentlessly, her refusal to give you room to breathe. This is not simply reused animation budget or a design team recycling assets for efficiency, though obviously that's part of any development reality. Narratively, it lines up exactly with the reveal that his resurrected body is fused with hers. You are, in a very real sense, fighting Radon and Malenia simultaneously, his skill and gravity magic layered over her rot and her aggression. Two demigods who once fought each other to a catastrophic standstill now sharing a single reconstructed body. And you, the player, are the one who has to face what that fusion produced. There's also the presence of Miquella himself in that fight, and his final, most direct confrontation with the player, having emerged from his cocoon. And the specific detail that stands out is how the fight against this combined Radon-Malenia entity connects directly into your confrontation with Miquella's own attempt to charm and bind you the way he's bound everyone else drawn into his orbit. You are fighting through the physical remains of his sister, wearing the shape of the man who defeated her, as the final obstacle standing between you and Miquella's completed godhood. It's difficult to construct a more thorough, more literal statement of everything we've discussed about Malenia's role across her entire arc, raw material, instrument, obstacle, finally, in the last analysis, something used in service of her brother's larger project, right up to and including the final boss gauntlet of the story. I think it's worth pausing here to notice something about how differently this DLC content lands compared to the base game's Malenia fight, because the emotional register is almost inverted. The base game fight makes you feel like you're ending someone's exhausting, decades-long fight to remain herself. It's sad, but it's also, in its own way, a kind of mercy, an ending to a struggle that had clearly become unsustainable even for a demigod's endurance. The DLC content, by contrast, doesn't offer you that same sense of closure or mercy at all. It reveals that even death did not actually end her instrumentalization, that her remains were repurposed, that the story of Malenia being used, however lovingly, for someone else's purposes did not stop when her heart, or whatever a demigod's equivalent of a heart is, stopped. If the base game fight is a tragic ending, the Dilk reveal retroactively turns that ending into something closer to a comma. The story kept happening to her after she was no longer in a position to have any say in it. I don't think this is From Software being needlessly cruel to a fan-favorite character for shock value, though I understand why it can feel that way on first encounter. I think it's the logical, honest conclusion of a character whose entire narrative function, from the very first item description about an intense, troubling twin bond, has been about a person whose body, whose choices, whose entire existence has been shaped and reshaped by forces and people outside her own control. First her disease, then her family's attempts to manage that disease, then her family's larger cosmic ambitions, and finally, after her own death, her own physical remains repurposed for the next stage of those ambitions. It's a bleak through line, but it's a coherent one, and it's been there. In plain sight, since the beginning, for anyone willing to actually read the item descriptions instead of skipping past them to get to the next fight. I want to spend some real time now in more speculative territory, because there are still genuine unresolved mysteries around Malenia that the game does not answer, and I think working through the possibilities seriously, rather than just flagging them as unknowable and moving on, is worth doing, especially given how much of her story we've now established has a coherent internal logic even in its most disturbing corners. The first open question is simply this: how did Malenia actually die? And the timeline between the base game's ending and the events revealed in Shadow of the Erd Tree. The base game leaves her fate genuinely ambiguous if you don't fight her, and even if you do fight her and defeat her, the fiction is deliberately unclear about whether the player character's victory is what actually kills her, or whether it's something closer to a duel that ends when she can no longer continue, with her actual death happening off-screen, later. For reasons the game never directly shows us. The DLC confirms she's dead by the time of its own timeline, her remains fused into Radahn's resurrected body, but it does not explain the mechanism. Did she die from the fight with the player character, whichever ending the player pursued? Did she die afterward, from the accumulated cost of decades spent maintaining rot-grown limbs and containing an active infection through sheer discipline, finally succumbing once nothing was left to sustain that effort? Did Miquella have some direct hand in her death, as part of whatever process led to her being repurposed for the Radahn fusion? The game gives us no clean answer, and I think that ambiguity is deliberate, in keeping with everything else about how her story refuses to resolve into a single tidy narrative. The theory I find most compelling, though I want to be clear this is theorycraft rather than confirmed text, is that Malenia's death was not a single discrete event at all, but rather the actual, final completion of the process we discussed earlier. The process where Scarlet Rot has been slowly, patiently converting her from a demigod who carries the disease into something the disease is simply wearing. Under this reading, the fight the player has with her, whether in the base game or in the reconstructed form the DLC presents, is not what kills Malenia in any simple sense. It's the visible expression of a slow-motion transformation that was always going to complete itself eventually, with or without a player character showing up to hasten it. The Rot wins eventually the way it apparently always wins against anything it touches for long enough, and what's left afterward is raw material. Not because anyone specifically decided to reduce her to raw material, but because that is simply the terminal state of a body that has spent decades losing an unwinnable war against an outer god's patient hunger. Miquella's later decision to use her remains for the Radahn fusion, under this reading, isn't the cause of her becoming raw material. It's a second separate act of instrumentalization that happens after the Rot has already finished the first one. The second open question, and this one I think is genuinely more important than it initially appears, is what it actually means that Scarlet Rot, as an outer god's influence, seemingly targeted Malenia specifically, in infancy, rather than any other demigod child of Radagon and Marika. Was this random, the way an ordinary infectious disease might strike one child in a large family and spare the others through simple chance? Or was there something specific about Malenia, something in her nature, her position as Miquella's twin, her particular configuration as a demigod, that made her a more suitable vessel, more penetrable, more compatible with what this outer god was trying to accomplish? If it's the latter, and I lean toward thinking the game wants us to at least entertain this possibility given how deliberately everything else about her story is constructed, then the twin bond with Miquella is not simply a tragic coincidence that happened to run alongside the Rot infection. It may be causally connected to it. Two souls fused unusually closely together at birth, closer than the Golden Order itself found comfortable, may have created exactly the kind of structural vulnerability, the kind of porousness between self and other, that made Malenia specifically susceptible to an outside force learning to root itself in her in a way it might not have been able to root itself in a demigod with more conventional, more bounded selfhood. Under this reading, the very thing that was supposed to protect her, her fusion with Miquella, her never having to exist as a fully separate individual, may be the same structural feature that let the Rot in the first place, and Miquella's lifelong efforts to save her may have been tragically fighting a problem his own bond with her helped create. I don't think this is provable from the text as it currently exists, and I want to be honest about that rather than presenting speculation as settled fact. But I think it's the kind of reading that rewards the pattern From Software has established across their broader catalog of work, not just within Elden Ring specifically. This is a studio with a long, consistent history of building stories where the thing meant to save a character and the thing that dooms them turn out to be structurally identical, where protection and vulnerability are not opposites but two faces of the same underlying condition. You see versions of this throughout Bloodborne, where the very act of seeking knowledge and insight that promises to elevate you beyond ordinary human limitation is simultaneously the mechanism by which cosmic horrors gain purchase on your mind. You see it in Dark Souls, where the undead curse that dooms so many characters to endless, meaningless cycles of rebirth and decay is inseparable from the fire-linking ritual that was supposed to preserve the Age of Fire in the first place. Malenia's story fits comfortably inside that same authorial pattern. The bond meant to save her is plausibly, structurally, the same bond that made her savable from in the first place, in the sense that it may have opened the exact door the Rot needed. Let's talk about how this compares to other Outer God vessels across the game, because I think putting Malenia in conversation with the other major examples helps clarify what makes her specific situation so unusual, even within a cast of characters who are, almost without exception, dealing with some version of cosmic contamination or cosmic favor. The Godskin Apostles and Godskin Nobles, recurring boss enemies you encounter multiple times across the game, represent another kind of Outer God relationship entirely, one built around the formless mother and the three fingers. Similar in some ways to Mohg's situation, but distinct in that the Godskin faction has essentially given themselves over entirely, becoming almost interchangeable vessels for the same underlying corrupting force, resurrecting again and again in slightly different bodies, because the individual identity underneath the affliction has essentially stopped mattering. That's instructive as a contrast, because it shows you the fully surrendered endpoint, a group of people for whom individual selfhood has been almost entirely subsumed by what's possessing them, to the point where their deaths barely register as deaths, more as temporary interruptions. Malenia never gets there, and I think that's actually the single most important thing to understand about her, the thing that separates her from every other Outer God-touched character in the game. Even at her absolute worst, even in the second phase of the boss fight, where the Rot has clearly, visibly overwhelmed whatever containment she's maintained, she is still recognizably herself. Her fighting style in that second phase is faster, wilder, more desperate, but it is still her fighting style. Still built on the same underlying swordsmanship, still identifiably the same person underneath the transformation. She never becomes a godskin, never becomes simply an interchangeable vessel for the Rot's will. Whatever else has been taken from her, whatever else has been imposed on her, her identity, her actual selfhood, survives every single crisis her story puts her through, right up until, arguably, the moment of her death itself. That persistence, that refusal to fully dissolve even under conditions that would have dissolved almost anyone else, is I think the single most heroic thing about her, more heroic in its way than her undefeated dueling record, because it's a victory that had to be won continuously, every single day of her life, with no possibility of ever declaring it permanently finished. This is also, I think, what makes the DLC's revelation about her remains being used to reconstruct Radahn so much more painful than it would be for almost any other character in the game. If this had happened to a Godskin, if their remains had been repurposed for some later project, it would barely register as tragic. Because Godskins have already, functionally, surrendered the individual selfhood that would make such repurposing feel like a violation. But it happens to Malenia, a character whose entire arc is defined by her refusal to surrender that selfhood under any circumstance, by her continuous exhausting insistence on remaining herself against every possible pressure to become something else. Her body being used as raw material after death isn't simply sad in the generic way that any character's death and repurposing might be sad. It's specifically, precisely a violation of the one thing she spent her entire life protecting, the thing she never let the Rot take from her while she was alive. Death is where she finally loses the fight she'd been winning, against overwhelming odds, every single day up until then. I want to shift gears for a while and talk about Malenia as a cultural phenomenon outside the text itself, because I think the way the community has engaged with her, particularly around the difficulty of her fight, actually tells us something real about how effectively the game communicated her thematic weight. Even to players who never read a single item description. Waterfowl Dance became, almost immediately after the game's release, one of the most discussed, most memed, most agonized over attacks in the entire history of the Souls genre. A 3-hit flurry of aerial slashes that covers enormous distance, tracks aggressively, and punishes almost any positioning mistake with what can be 40, 50, sometimes more than 60% of a fully built character's health bar in a single unbroken sequence. Entire YouTube careers have been built on guides explaining how to survive it. Speedrunners developed increasingly precise, increasingly inhuman strategies for either avoiding it entirely or tanking through it with specific builds. It became, in the broader gaming discourse, shorthand for a certain kind of merciless, almost punitive difficulty design. The attack you'd bring up if someone asked you what makes Elden Ring's hardest content actually hard, as opposed to simply time-consuming. What I find interesting about this, having walked through everything we've covered about what that Phase 2 transformation actually represents narratively, is that the community's visceral, often furious response to Waterfowl Dance, the sense that it feels unfair, feels like the game turning against you specifically at the moment you thought you'd earned a win, is actually a pretty precise emotional mirror of what's happening in the fiction at that exact moment. The player has, by the point Waterfowl Dance becomes available, pushed Malenia's health low enough to trigger Phase 2, meaning the player has, within the story, pushed her past the point of controlled containment. What follows, mechanically brutal, desperate. All or nothing in a way her first phase never was, is not the game being cruel for its own sake. It's the game accurately simulating what it would actually feel like to be on the receiving end of an outer god's affliction, finally breaking loose from whatever discipline had been holding it in check, aimed at you with the full, desperate force of something that knows this might be its last chance to survive the encounter. The unfairness players feel, viscerally, in that moment is, whether the designers intended this level of thematic precision or not, an accurate transmission of exactly what the fiction says is happening. I don't think every player who's raged at Waterfowl Dance has consciously connected it to the lore we've spent the last hour and a half unpacking, and that's fine. That's not a requirement for the design to work. But I think it's worth noting how often, in community discussions, in comment sections, and Reddit threads, you see players who beat this fight describe a strange emotional aftertaste that goes beyond simple relief or triumph, describe feeling bad for her, describe the fight as sad in a way they can't fully articulate mechanically. I think what's happening there is that the game successfully communicated the emotional truth of Malenia's situation through pure mechanical and animated storytelling, independent of whether the player ever engaged with a single piece of written lore. That's an unusually difficult thing to pull off, communicating tragedy through boss design rather than through dialogue or cutscene. And I think it's a large part of why Malenia has endured years after release as one of the most discussed, most analyzed characters in the entire game, arguably in the entire genre. There's also a broader mythological resonance worth drawing out here, because Malenia's story, once you lay it out in full, sits comfortably alongside a very old, very cross-cultural pattern of myths about figures whose divinity and disease are inseparable, whose sacred status and their affliction are structurally the same thing viewed from different angles. You see versions of this in myths about oracles whose prophetic power comes bundled with a curse that makes their prophecies useless, or their bodies wrecked by the burden of holding divine knowledge. You see it in stories about saints whose visions of the divine are indistinguishable, medically, from what we now recognize as severe illness, their sanctity and their suffering treated by their communities as two names for the same underlying condition. Malenia fits into that very old narrative shape almost perfectly, a figure whose closeness to a cosmic force, in her case, an outer god's rot, is simultaneously what makes her extraordinary, what makes her the undefeated blade of Miquella, and what is slowly, patiently killing her, with no way to have one without the other. That's not a new story. It's an ancient one, dressed in From Software's specific grim aesthetic vocabulary, and I think part of why it lands as powerfully as it does is that it's tapping into a narrative pattern human storytelling has returned to again and again across an enormous span of cultures and centuries. The idea that the price of touching something greater than yourself is very often your own ordinary well-being, and that the people who touch the divine most closely are very rarely the ones who get to live comfortably afterward. Let's go back to the game's actual ending content now, because there's a piece of this we haven't fully unpacked yet, which is what it means, concretely, for a player pursuing the Age of Compassion, ending to essentially be told, through item description and implication, that Malenia is intended, or was intended, to serve at Miquella's side in the new order he's attempting to build. I raised this earlier in the context of consent and the twin bond, but I want to come back to it now with everything else we've established, because I think it deserves a second pass with the full weight of the DLC's revelations sitting behind it. If Malenia is already dead by the time of the Land of Shadows events, if her remains have already been repurposed into the Radon fusion, then any base game implication that she was meant to stand beside Miquella as consort in his new divine order becomes, retroactively, something closer to a broken promise, or an abandoned plan, or possibly evidence that Miquella's ambitions shifted, or accelerated, or simply outran whatever timeline would have been required to actually heal her and bring that vision to fruition. This adds another layer to the tragedy that I don't think gets discussed nearly enough. Whatever Miquella's original intentions were regarding Malenia's role in his future, and I think the game genuinely wants us to believe those intentions were sincere, loving. Even if troublingly coercive in their execution, they apparently did not survive contact with however things actually played out. The plan changed, or failed, or simply never had the chance to be realized because Malenia's body gave out, or was defeated, or succumbed to the Rot's slow completion, before Miquella's larger project reached the stage where he could actually deliver on whatever he'd promised her, implicitly or explicitly, about her place in the world he was trying to build. This is, I think, the final turn of the knife in Malenia's story, if you want to read it that way. And I want to be clear, I think this reading is well supported, rather than simply the darkest possible interpretation for its own sake. A lifetime of devotion, of subordinating her own existence to a bond in a project she never chose, culminating in a promised future at her brother's side, in a remade divine order, a future that, whatever its own troubling implications about consent and autonomy, would at least have represented some kind of continuation, some kind of ongoing place for her in whatever came next. And instead, she dies, apparently before that future arrives. And what actually happens to her is not elevation to consort, but reduction to raw material for an entirely different project, the reconstruction of the one man who ever beat her in single combat. The promised future never came. What came instead was one more act of being used, and this time there was no possibility of her having any say in it at all, because by then, she was no longer in any position to have a say in anything. I don't want to leave this entirely in the register of pure tragedy without acknowledging the genuine ambiguity the game preserves, because I think that ambiguity is actually important, and I don't want to pretend the darkest reading is the only defensible one. It's entirely possible, and there's textual room for this, that the fusion with Radon was not simply Miquella discarding his original plans for Malenia and repurposing her as scrap, but was instead his own attempt, however twisted in execution, to give her a kind of continuation, to ensure that something of her persisted, fused permanently with the one opponent whose skill she genuinely respected, rather than simply letting her remains dissolve into nothing after death, the way an ordinary demigods might. Under this more generous reading, the fusion is Miquella's clumsy, grief-stricken attempt at honoring her, at making sure her extraordinary swordsmanship and her extraordinary rival did not simply vanish from the world, even if the method he chose to accomplish that is, by any normal ethical standard, deeply troubling. I don't think the game forces you to choose definitively between these readings, and I think that's intentional. Malenia's story has never offered clean answers about the difference between love and use, between devotion and instrumentalization, and it doesn't start offering them now, at the very end. Let's spend some time now on the smaller, more concrete pieces of evidence. The actual weapons and armor and item descriptions tied directly to her, because I think there's real value in slowing down and looking at the specific objects the game hands you after you defeat her, since each one adds a little more texture to everything we've built up so far. The Hand of Malenia, the weapon you receive from her remembrance, is described in terms that emphasize its status as a weapon wielded by an undefeated warrior, but it's the flavor text surrounding her prosthetic limb, and the specific item you can craft from her remembrance related to that limb, that carries the heaviest implications. The prosthesis itself is described in language that treats it less like an artificial replacement, and more like a living extension, something that grew rather than something that was built, reinforcing everything we discussed earlier about her rot-grown limbs not being separate from her body, but functionally, organically part of it. This distinction matters mechanically too. If you've played the fight closely, her prosthetic leg is the limb she uses for some of her most aggressive kicking and repositioning attacks, moving with the same fluid, dangerous grace as the rest of her body, no hint of mechanical stiffness or hesitation, because within the fiction, it isn't a separate mechanical attachment bolted onto flesh. It's wrought, shaped by her will into the form a leg needs to take, functioning as well as, arguably better than, the limb it replaced. Her armor set, When you actually stop to look at the individual piece descriptions rather than just admiring the silhouette, tells its own quiet story about discipline as armor, literally and figuratively. The descriptions emphasize its ceremonial, almost formal quality, the armor of someone who understood combat as something closer to ritual than to chaos. Every plate and joint designed for precise, controlled movement, rather than raw, destructive power. That formality again tracks with everything we discussed about her first boss phase. The discipline that holds the Rot in check being expressed even in the specific aesthetic choices of her equipment, right down to the way her sword Melody, described as unusually light and quick for a weapon of its category, seems built entirely around precision and control, rather than overwhelming force, a weapon suited to someone whose entire fighting philosophy is built around never losing. Composure, right up until, mechanically and narratively, she does. I think these smaller details matter because they demonstrate just how thoroughly consistent Malenia's design is across every layer of the game. From her animation set to her weapon stats, to her armor's individual piece descriptions, to the sweeping cosmological implications of what Scarlet Rot actually is within this world's theology. There isn't a single element of her design, as far as I've been able to find across an enormous amount of digging through this game's text, that contradicts or undercuts the reading we've built up over the last 2 hours. Everything, from the biggest cosmic horror implications about outer gods contesting territory inside her body, down to the smallest detail about how her prosthetic leg moves in combat, reinforces the same underlying portrait, a demigod defined, completely and totally, by the ongoing, exhausting, ultimately losing project of remaining herself against a disease that has never, for one single day since her infancy, stopped trying to make her something else. I want to widen the frame one more time before we start moving towards synthesis, because there's a piece of context involving Marika and Radagon's broader project with their children that reframes Malenia's suffering as something less like an isolated family tragedy and more like a symptom of a much larger, much colder pattern running through the entire ruling family of the lands between. Marika's children, across the board, are not treated by her, or by the Golden Order's broader machinery, as children in any sense we'd recognize as ordinary. They are functionally instruments of policy, vessels for specific theological and political projects Marika needed executed. Godwin was sent to broker peace and stability through his own eventual catastrophic death. A death Marika apparently arranged, or at minimum permitted, for reasons tied to preventing an even worse prophesied outcome. Morgott and Moog were both born deformed, omen-marked, and hidden away, treated as shameful secrets rather than children. Existing evidence of imperfection the Golden Order's narrative of unified, uncorrupted divinity could not afford to acknowledge publicly. Randy rejected her own assigned rules so completely that she orchestrated an entire elaborate, decades-long plan simply to escape the fate Marika and the Golden Order had planned for her. And Malenia and Miquella, fused together from birth, were shaped from infancy by Malenia's affliction into instruments first of survival, then of Miquella's larger ambitions, never once given. As far as any text shows us, the space to exist is anything other than useful, or managed, or contained. The pattern across literally every one of Marika's children the game gives us meaningful information about is the same. None of them get to simply be children who grow into adults who choose their own paths. Every single one of them is shaped, early and often violently, into serving some larger project, whether that project is the Golden Order's stability, the family's hidden shame, an escape plan decades in the making, or a twin's desperate childhood attempt at survival that calcifies into a lifetime of managed containment. Malenia's suffering, when you place it against this backdrop, stops looking like an unusually cruel exception and starts looking like the norm for what it apparently meant to be born into this particular family. She is not the only one of Marika's children whose body and life were shaped by forces entirely outside her control before she was old enough to have any say in the matter. She's simply, arguably, the one for whom that shaping was most literal, most physically inscribed into her actual flesh, in the form of a disease that got there before she'd even had the chance to form a single memory of her own. I think this context matters because it prevents Malenia's story from being read as simply one particularly sad demigod had an especially bad life. It reframes her as one especially visible, especially thoroughly documented example of a structural pattern that runs through the entire ruling family of this world. A pattern where the price of divine bloodline is very rarely autonomy, and very often something closer to being repeatedly, generationally instrumentalized by whatever larger cosmic or political project your specific existence happens to be useful for. Marika built an entire religious order around unifying and stabilizing the lands between under one coherent law, and the actual lived cost of building that order, generation after generation, was paid overwhelmingly by her own children's bodies and lives, none of whom, as far as the text shows us, were ever meaningfully asked whether they wanted to pay it. Now let's bring this back down to the specific, and start moving toward pulling everything we've covered into something like a coherent whole. Because I think after 2.5 hours of walking through this character piece by piece, it's worth actually stepping back and asking what all of it adds up to. What the overall shape of Malenia's story actually is, once you stop looking at any single piece in isolation. Start with a child, an infant demigod, infected almost immediately with an active, hungry outer god's influence, an infection that should have killed her outright, and would have, if not for a twin brother's desperate, unprecedented intervention. That intervention did not cure her. It could not cure her. It bought time, and in buying time, it established the fundamental pattern of her entire existence. Survival contingent on continuous outside intervention, discipline substituting for actual health, containment substituting for actual cure. From that point forward, nothing about Malenia's life gets to be simple. Every relationship she has, with her brother, with her family, with the Golden Order that claims her as one of its own demigods while simultaneously treating her with the careful unease you'd reserve for a contained threat, is shaped by the fact that she is, structurally, two things at once: a person and a live theological event happening inside a person's body. Move forward to adulthood, to the undefeated dueling record, to the discipline that lets her hold the rot in check well enough to function, to fight, to win, again and again right up until Radon. That fight is not simply a loss. It's the first moment her entire strategy for existing, discipline as containment, meets a challenge severe enough to actually break it, and what breaks loose when it fails is not just personal defeat, but a regional catastrophe. An entire fertile land converted, seemingly by her own hand or at minimum through her own body, into the diseased wasteland every player who's walked through Caelid has had to survive. That single afternoon defines the rest of her life in ways that never stop reverberating, the lost limbs rebuilt out of the very disease that caused their loss. The decades spent preserving Radon in eternal suspension, rather than letting the consequences of that battle finally, fully resolve the guilt or respect or some inseparable fusion of both that keeps her tethered to that one moment of defeat for the rest of her existence. Move to the Haligtree, the sanctuary built with genuine love and genuine desperation, planted directly in the wound Ionia's catastrophe left behind, as if trying to grow a cure out of the exact soil the disaster had poisoned. It fails, not through anyone's malice, but because you cannot plant an uncorrupted seed of divine order into already corrupted ground and expect a clean result, and what grows instead is beautiful and hostile and thorned. A physical manifestation of an unfinished, ultimately unsuccessful cure. Malenia sleeps there, incomplete, while Miquella's attention, however much love genuinely underpins it, eventually turns toward a larger, more consuming ambition, and she wakes alone, in a tomb built to save her that instead became one more thing she has to endure, one more place where the promise of rescue quietly, without any single cruel moment you can point to, curdled into abandonment. And then the fight itself, the thing most players actually experience directly, without necessarily knowing any of what came before it. A disciplined, controlled first phase that breaks, under sufficient pressure, into a second phase that is not a monster revealed beneath a mask but the most honest expression of a body that has spent decades being slowly, patiently rebuilt out of the very thing trying to consume it. Winning that fight is not ending a threat. It's watching someone's last, exhausting effort to remain herself finally, mercifully or tragically depending on how you want to read it, give out. And then death, whenever and however it actually happened, off-screen, ambiguous, never directly shown. And then, worst of all, what comes after death, not rest, not conclusion, but repurposing. Her remains fused into the reconstructed body of the one man who ever beat her, resurrected by her own brother as an instrument in his final push toward a godhood built on a compassion, so total it no longer asks anyone's permission before reshaping them. Even death does not get to be the end of the story for Malenia. It becomes, instead, one more raw material extracted from a life that had already, by that point, spent every other resource it had to give. I don't think there's a single tidy moral to draw from all of this, and I'm suspicious of any lore video, including potentially this one, that tries to wrap 2.5 hours of a character's suffering into a single clean sentence of takeaway. But if I had to identify the single thread that runs through every single piece of this story, from the childhood infection through the Radon battle, through the failed cure, through the boss fight, through the Diltzi's brutal final reveal, it would be this. Malenia never once, at any point in her entire existence, gets to simply exist as an end in herself. She is always instrumental to her own survival's continuation, to Miquella's childhood desperation, to the Golden Order's uneasy tolerance, to Miquella's larger ambitions, to the reconstruction of Radon. Every single relationship in her life, every single structure built around her, whether out of love or fear or genuine desperate care, treats her in the end as a means towards some other end, never quite as simply. Fully herself, valuable and worth protecting, for no reason beyond her own existence. And yet I don't think that reading, bleak as it is actually the whole story. Because I think there is one place, maybe the only place, in her entire narrative where Malenia genuinely, unambiguously acts for herself, on her own terms, with no larger project or family obligation dictating the outcome. And that's the fight against the player character. Think about what that fight actually is, structurally within the fiction. By the time you reach her, she is not fighting because Miquella asked her to. He's gone. She's not fighting to preserve some larger political order. The Golden Order barely factors into her motivations at that point in the story. She's not fighting for territory or survival in any practical sense. She's fighting because you have entered her domain, the one space she has left, the dueling hall in Elphael that represents the last piece of order she's managed to maintain, and she is defending it, and defending her own unbroken record, entirely on her own terms, as the last fully autonomous act of a life that has otherwise been shaped, managed, and directed by everyone around her since infancy. There's something genuinely important in that. I think something that changes how you should feel about the fight beyond simple tragedy. When Malenia fights you, she is, for maybe the only sustained stretch of time in her entire existence, not doing it for Miquella, not doing it in service of a cure, not doing it to manage or contain or preserve anything on anyone else's behalf. She's doing it because she is a warrior who has never lost, defending that fact against a challenger, on her own terms, in the one room she still controls. It's the closest thing her story gives us to a moment of pure, unmediated selfhood. And I think that's worth honoring precisely because it's so rare in her narrative. Everything else in her life was shaped by circumstance and by other people's needs. This one fight, whatever else it represents thematically about disease and containment and cosmic horror, is also simultaneously, simply, Malenia, being exactly and only herself, on ground she chose, defending a record that belongs to no one but her. I think this is actually why so many players describe such complicated, layered feelings after beating her. Feelings that don't reduce neatly to either that was awesome or that was sad. Both are true, and I think the game wants both to be true at once. Because the fight is simultaneously the tragic culmination of an entire life defined by other people's needs, and also the one moment where that same life gets to express itself, purely, without mediation, without obligation, without anyone else's larger project pulling the strings. Ending her life, in that context, is not simply ending a victim's suffering, and it's not simply defeating a monster. It's interrupting the one genuinely self-directed act she ever gets to have, which is its own kind of tragedy, layered on top of all the others, but it's also, I think, a kind of respect the game is quietly asking you to extend her, treating that fight, that specific dueling hall, that specific undefeated record, as something worth taking completely seriously on its own terms, not simply as a symptom of everything that came before it. Let's talk about what undefeated actually costs, because I don't think we've fully sat with the psychological weight of that specific fact yet, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions that treat it as simply an impressive stat, evidence of how strong she is, rather than as a specific heavy burden she has apparently chosen, or been forced by circumstance, to carry as central to her entire identity. Being undefeated as an organizing principle for an entire life is an enormously fragile foundation to build a self around, because it means every single fight carries the full weight of everything that came before it. It cannot simply be won or lost on its own terms. Every duel Malenia has ever fought has been, implicitly, a referendum on the entire unbroken record, which means every single fight has carried stakes far beyond whatever the immediate, practical consequences of that particular battle might be. That's an exhausting way to exist, psychologically, even before you layer on top of it a disease actively trying to consume you from within. A family that loves you while simultaneously treating you as something requiring careful management, and a childhood built around surviving rather than simply living. To have chosen, or to have been left with no better option than, an identity built entirely around never losing, and a body that is quite literally falling apart from the inside for her entire life, suggests someone whose sense of self has become almost entirely externalized, dependent on outcomes rather than on any more stable internal sense of who she is, independent of whether she wins or loses her next fight. Which makes the loss to Radin even more devastating to think about than we've already established, because if her entire sense of self was organized around that unbroken record, then losing it wasn't simply a battlefield defeat with unfortunate regional consequences. It may have been something closer to an actual psychological rupture, the collapse of the one stable pillar she had left to organize her identity around, and a life that had already by that point given her almost nothing else stable to hold on to. Her body was compromised from infancy. Her family relationship was loving but structurally coercive. Her sense of safety depended entirely on Miquella's continued intervention. The one thing that was unambiguously, completely hers, the one achievement no disease and no family obligation could take credit for or claim ownership over, was that record. And Radon took it. Whatever the immediate physical trigger for the rot bloom that devastated Aeonia actually was, whether deliberate weaponization or involuntary collapse, I think it's worth considering that losing the one pillar of stable identity she had left may have been psychologically exactly the kind of rupture that would make losing control of a disease she'd spent her entire life disciplining herself to contain, suddenly, catastrophically, far more plausible than it would have been on an ordinary day against an ordinary opponent in an ordinary fight. Let's bring Ranni into this conversation properly now, because I think she functions as one of the most instructive foils to Malenia in the entire game, precisely because their situations start from remarkably similar premises and diverge so completely in their outcomes. Ranni, like Malenia, is one of Mareka's children, treated from an early age as an instrument of a larger project. In Ranni's case, a specific prophesied destiny the Golden Order intended her to fulfill, one that would have required her death and the destruction of her own selfhood in service of maintaining the Golden Order's continuity. And Ranni, unlike Malenia, said no. She spent decades orchestrating an elaborate, quietly ruthless plan to escape that fate entirely, engineering her own body's death. Operating for most of the game's timeline through a doll while her actual consciousness pursued an entirely separate agenda, one built around dismantling the very cosmic order that had tried to claim her as an instrument, and replacing it with something built around her own chosen values, her own chosen path, her own version of the future, rather than the one that had been assigned to her at birth. Ranni got out. Whatever you think of the specific ending her questline leads to, the Age of the Stars built around solitude and quiet, self-determined order rather than the Golden Order's imposed unity. The core fact of her arc is that she refused the role assigned to her and successfully built an alternative. Malenia never gets that option. Not really, not in any sustained way. The closest she comes is that one dueling hall, that one fight, that single sustained stretch of pure self-directed action we just discussed, and even that is ultimately interrupted, ended by the player, folded back into the larger tragic arc of her life rather than becoming the foundation for some alternative future the way Ranni's rebellion becomes the foundation for hers. Why the difference? I don't think it's simply that Ranni is written as more clever or more willful than Malenia, though the text does present her as exceptionally cunning even among an already exceptional family. I think the more important difference is structural. Ranni's assigned fate required her death, which paradoxically gave her something to actually rebel against, a discrete, specific outcome she could refuse and route around. Malenia's situation never offered that same clarity. Her affliction wasn't an external fate imposed on her by prophecy that she could simply refuse to fulfill. It was inside her body from infancy, inseparable from her own physical existence, with no clean point of external imposition to identify and reject. You cannot orchestrate an elaborate escape plan against a disease that is, by the time you're old enough to understand what's happening to you, already partially constitutive of who you physically are. Ranni had an enemy she could locate outside herself. Malenia's enemy, in the most literal sense possible, was inside her, had been inside her since before she could form memories. and eventually became load-bearing infrastructure for her own continued physical existence. There was no version of Ranni's escape available to her, because there was no clean boundary between the thing oppressing her and the body she needed to survive in order to resist it. I think that comparison also clarifies something important about why Malenia's story resonates so differently from Ranni's. Even though both are, at their core, stories about demigods born into instrumentalization by a larger cosmic and political project, Ranni's story, for all its own darkness, its own body horror, its own moral complexity around the deaths and betrayals required to execute her escape, is ultimately a story about liberation successfully achieved. It's satisfying in the way stories about clever, patient rebellion against an oppressive system are satisfying. Malenia's story offers no equivalent satisfaction, because there was no clean system to rebel against, no external fate to refuse, only a body that was, from the very beginning, both self and affliction simultaneously, with no seam between the two clean enough to pry apart. Her story isn't a story about escaping instrumentalization. It's a story about what happens when escape was never structurally available, when the only available response to being shaped by forces outside your control is not rebellion but endurance, not escape but discipline, not victory over your circumstances but the much smaller, much more exhausting achievement of remaining recognizably yourself for as long as you possibly can within them. I don't think that makes her story less valuable than Ranni's, or somehow a lesser version of the same narrative pattern. I think it makes her story a different, equally important kind of narrative, one that From Software doesn't tell nearly as often as the rebellion and escape story, precisely because it's harder to make satisfying, harder to resolve, harder to end on anything that feels like triumph rather than exhaustion. Malenia's story matters specifically because it refuses the comfortable shape of successful escape. It insists on sitting with what it actually looks like when someone is born into circumstances with no clean exit available, and asks you to find whatever meaning is available in that person's refusal to simply dissolve, rather than in their ability to eventually break free. I want to close by talking about what defeating her actually means for the Tarnished, for the player character, because I think this final piece of context changes how the entire fight should sit with you. And it's something that's easy to lose track of across 2.5 hours of focusing entirely on Malenia's own story. The Tarnished, in the base game's framing, is themselves a kind of instrument, guided by grace, pursuing the Elden Ring's restoration or destruction depending on which path you choose, walking through a world entirely populated by other instrumentalized figures. Demigods and knights and NPCs whose lives have all, in various ways, been shaped and directed by forces larger than themselves. The Greater Will, the Golden Order, ambitious rivals, cosmic hunger. When the Tarnished fights Malenia, two instruments of larger forces are meeting in that dueling hall, and I think there's something worth sitting with in the fact that the player character's entire quest, however it eventually resolves, however much autonomy the various endings suggest the Tarnished eventually claims, begins as exactly the same kind of externally directed, externally shaped existence that has defined Malenia's entire life. You are not so different from her, structurally, at the start of this journey, guided by grace toward a destiny you did not choose, walking a path laid out by forces you can barely comprehend, let alone control. Whether the Tarnished ultimately breaks free of that pattern, the way Ranni does, or ultimately fulfills someone else's design in a new configuration, the way several of the base game's other endings suggest, depends entirely on the choices a given player makes across the back half of the story. But I think it's worth carrying the shape of Malenia's story with you into whatever ending you choose, because her story is, in a sense, a warning about what happens to demigods and Tarnished alike when the forces shaping their lives never once pause to ask what they themselves actually want. She is, in the end, the clearest, most fully realized example the game gives you of what total instrumentalization costs a person, even when that instrumentalization is carried out by people who genuinely love them. Even when every individual decision made about her life was made, as far as we can tell, with real care and real desperation to help. Love was never the missing ingredient in Malenia's story. Autonomy was. And I think that's the sharpest, most quietly devastating thing this character's entire arc has to say, not just about her specifically, but about every other figure walking through this world under the weight of someone else's larger design, including, if you let it land, the player character standing in that dueling hall, sword drawn, about to end the last fully self-directed act of her entire existence. There's one perspective we haven't given proper weight to yet, and I think leaving it out would make this whole analysis lopsided, tilted too far towards sympathy without acknowledging the actual scale of harm involved. And that's the perspective of the people who were not demigods, not knights, not anyone with a name the game bothers to give you, the ordinary population of Aeonia who were simply living their lives in a fertile, populated region when two demigods decided to settle a duel there, and one of them, deliberately or not, unleashed an outer god's disease across the entire landscape as a consequence. We don't get named characters from among Aeonia's ordinary population. We get their absence, we get their ruins, we get the wandering, rot-twisted remnants of what were once, presumably, entire families, entire communities, entire lives that had nothing whatsoever to do with the rivalry between Malenia and Radon, nothing to do with Miquella's ambitions, nothing to do with the Golden Order's theological anxieties about contained threats. They were simply there, living in a place that happened to become the battlefield for a conflict between forces vastly larger than themselves. And the consequence of that conflict was not a battlefield's worth of casualties among trained combatants who had at least implicitly accepted the risks of their profession. It was the complete, total destruction of an entire region's ability to sustain human life, a catastrophe that has been ongoing for decades by the time the player arrives, still actively killing anyone unfortunate enough to wander too far from Redmane Castle's defended perimeter. I raise this not to undercut everything we've said about Malenia's own suffering, which I think is real and well supported by the text, but because I think an honest reckoning with this character requires holding both things simultaneously, the way the game itself seems to want you to. Malenia is a deeply sympathetic figure, shaped by forces outside her control since infancy, denied autonomy at every turn, ultimately reduced to raw material even after death. All of that is true. It is also true that whatever combination of involuntary collapse and desperate final choice led to the rot bloom at Aeonia, the actual, concrete consequence of that moment was the annihilation of an entire populated region and the deaths, over decades, of an uncountable number of people who had no say whatsoever in the conflict that killed them. Sympathy for Malenia does not require erasing that cost, and I think the game is actually quite careful in its environmental storytelling throughout Caelid, to make sure you cannot forget it, to make sure the ruined festival banners and the collapsed homes and the endlessly wandering diseased remnants of what were once ordinary people stay present in your mind, even while you're building sympathy for the demigod whose crisis caused all of it. This is, I think, one of the more sophisticated things this story is doing, refusing to let either reading cancel out the other. Malenia's tragedy does not erase Aeonia's tragedy. Aeonia's tragedy does not erase Malenia's tragedy. Both exist, fully, at full weight, simultaneously, and the game trusts you to hold both, without needing to resolve them into a single simple verdict about whether Malenia is, in the end, more victim or more perpetrator. She is both, completely, and I'd argue that refusal to simplify is exactly what elevates this from a sad backstory attached to a hard boss fight into something closer to genuine tragedy in the classical sense, where the central figure's suffering and the suffering they cause are not separable, cleanly opposed categories, but two faces of the exact same catastrophe. Let's talk briefly about the choice the game offers you after defeating her, because even in the small, mechanical decision of what to do with her remembrance, there's thematic weight worth noticing. You can exchange it for the hand of Malenia, her own sword, allowing you to fight the way she fought, to carry forward her specific style of disciplined, precise swordplay into your own build.